I remember the exact smell of that night. Cold asphalt after rain. Diesel exhaust from a delivery truck idling at the corner of Mercer and Fifth. The faint sweetness of someone's takeout drifting from a lit window above me. I was standing beside my patrol car, one hand resting on the roof, watching the street the way you do when you've done it long enough that your eyes stop really seeing and your mind starts filling in the gaps. 12 years on the force does that to you. It turns observation into something automatic, something mechanical, like breathing. I had been assigned to a residential patrol route that autumn. Nothing dramatic. A quiet stretch of the city where the biggest incidents were noise complaints and the occasional domestic disturbance that turned out to be a couple arguing about who forgot to pay the cable bill. I knew every house, every porch light, every car parked on every block. That familiarity was both a comfort and a curse, because it meant that when something was wrong, even slightly, even invisibly, I noticed. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old. I've been a police officer for 12 years and a husband for 9. We have a daughter, Lily, who is 7, and a son, Marcus, who is 5. My wife is named Claire. Was named Claire. I suppose she still is, technically. Names don't change the way marriages do. Claire and I met at a fundraiser hosted by a mutual friend. She was laughing at something someone had said, and the laugh was so genuine, so unguarded, that I found myself staring at her from across the room for what was probably too long. She had dark auburn hair, green eyes, and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance but from knowing exactly who you are. I was drawn to that certainty. I had spent years in a job that required me to read people quickly, to assess threat levels, to interpret body language, to distinguish between honest fear and manufactured calm. And Claire, to me, read as utterly honest. I was wrong about that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We married after 2 years of dating. Bought a house on Claremont Avenue, a 10-minute drive from the precinct, in the kind of neighborhood where people still know their neighbors' names. Claire worked as a graphic designer for a mid-sized firm downtown. She was good at her job, creative and meticulous in equal measure, and she took pride in the projects she brought home. Spreading printed mock-ups across the kitchen table and talking through color palettes while Lily drew in her sketchbook beside her and Marcus narrated an ongoing war between his plastic dinosaurs on the floor. We were, by every visible measure, fine. That's the word I keep coming back to. Fine. Not extraordinary. Not passionate in the way that early years are, but steady, reliable, real, or so I believed. The kind of life that looks unremarkable from the outside but feels, to the people living it, like something worth protecting. I should have asked more questions. I should have looked harder at the edges of things, where the stitching starts to unravel. But you don't look for damage in something you believe is intact. That's the architecture of denial, not stupidity, not blindness, just the very human act of trusting what you've built. The night I'm telling you about was a Thursday in October. Cold, damp, with a low cloud cover that pressed the city's light back down onto the streets, giving everything a yellowish glow. I was 3 hours into my shift, patrolling a route that wound through a neighborhood adjacent to ours, close enough that I occasionally drove streets I recognized, past shops Claire and I frequented, past the park where Lily had her first bicycle lesson. I turned off Meridian Drive onto Ackley Street, a narrow residential road that I had passed through dozens of times without incident. There was a row of older apartment buildings on the east side, the kind with frosted lobby glass and brass-trimmed mailboxes, the kind that people called charming before they became expensive. I was checking a specific address. A resident had reported suspicious loitering near the entrance over the previous week, and so I was scanning the parked cars with professional attention. That's when I saw it. A silver Volvo parked at the curb, half in shadow. I knew that car the way you know your own heartbeat. The small chip in the lower left corner of the rear windshield from a stone on the highway 2 summers ago. The faded parking permit sticker from Lily's school that Claire had never gotten around to removing. The way the driver's side mirror sat at a slightly wider angle than the passenger side because I had adjusted it years ago for my height and Claire had never bothered to change it back. It was Claire's car. I slowed to a stop, left the engine running, sat there for a full 30 seconds doing nothing but looking. Our house was 2 streets away. I could have walked there in 6 minutes. And yet here was her car, parked outside an apartment building I had no reason to know, at 20 minutes past 10 on a Thursday night, when she had told me over the phone at 7 that she was home, that the kids were in bed, that she was just going to watch something and go to sleep. I told myself there was an explanation, that she'd gone out after all, for milk, for something simple, that she'd parked here for a reason I couldn't yet see. I told myself all the things a person tells themselves in the first seconds before reality takes hold. Then I looked up. On the 3rd floor of the building, a single window was lit. Warm amber light, the kind that comes from a lamp rather than an overhead fixture. The curtains were partially drawn, and in the gap between them, barely visible, was the outline of 2 figures standing close together. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the delivery truck on the next block to pull away. Long enough for a man with a dog to walk past my car without glancing at me. Long enough to feel something shift inside my chest. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, but slowly, like a floor giving way beneath weight it was never built to hold. I drove on. I completed the rest of my shift in a state that I can only describe as professional autopilot, responding to a noise complaint on Delwood, filing a routine check on a commercial alarm that turned out to be wind-triggered, writing up my notes with the same careful handwriting I always use. From the outside, nothing was different. Inside, something had cracked. I didn't go home until 6 in the morning when my shift ended. Claire was asleep. The house was quiet. Lily had left her backpack at the bottom of the stairs again, and Marcus's shoes were by the front door with the laces still tied, the way he always kicked them off. I stood in the kitchen and made coffee I didn't drink. And I began, very quietly, to pay attention. The thing about a marriage is that it creates its own language. Not words, exactly, more a shared vocabulary of habits, rhythms, small recurring moments that accumulate over years into something that feels permanent. The way Claire always set 2 mugs out the night before, even on mornings I worked early. The way she unconsciously tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating. The way she laughed at her own jokes a half-second before finishing them, as if she couldn't quite contain it. I had stopped noticing most of it. That's the honest truth. When something has been part of your daily life for 9 years, it stops registering as remarkable. You stop seeing it the way you once did, the way a stranger would. And in that blindness, things can change without your realizing. Gradually, the way a color fades in direct sunlight, until one day you look at it and understand it was never quite that bright again. In the days that followed that Thursday night, I began to notice things I had unconsciously trained myself to overlook. Claire's phone had always been accessible. Not in a performative way, we weren't the kind of couple who made a point of showing each other our screens, but accessible in the way that private things are when you have nothing to hide. Left on the kitchen counter, on her side of the bed, in her jacket pocket with the volume up. Now I became aware, without her saying anything, that it was always face down, that she carried it more deliberately, that she would glance at it and then glance away. Not toward me, not even at anything particular, just away, as if creating a small private moment that had nothing to do with the room she was in. I noticed she had started going to bed later. She had always been an early sleeper, 10:30 at the absolute latest, and she would often be asleep when I came home from late shifts. Now there were several nights when I came home past 11 to find her awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a glass of wine half-finished beside her. She would look up, smile in a way that was completely natural and completely impenetrable, and say something ordinary about not being tired yet. I said nothing, observed, filed it away. At work, I was functioning normally. My partner, a sharp, patient man named Ruiz who had been on the force for 20 years and had the particular talent of reading a situation without making anyone feel watched, noticed something in the 3rd or 4th day. He didn't say anything directly. He just handed me a coffee I hadn't asked for and let the silence do what silence does between partners who know each other well. "Rough week," he said eventually. "Just tired," I told him. He accepted that without comment, which was one of the things I respected most about him. Meanwhile, I started doing what I do on the job. I started looking. Not dramatically, not obsessively, not yet. Just methodically, the way you approach any investigation, gathering baseline data before drawing conclusions, because drawing conclusions before you have data is how you make mistakes that cost you. I checked the mileage on Claire's car. Not by writing it down, just by noticing. She drove to work, 45 minutes each way approximately, and to the school for pickups and occasionally to the grocery store on Elmfield, and that accounted for a predictable weekly accumulation. I noted the number on a Tuesday morning and looked again the following Monday. The difference was larger than it should have been by roughly 60 to 80 miles, depending on how many times she had deviated from her regular routes. 60 to 80 miles. In a city our size, that was enough to go somewhere and come back several times over without saying a word about it. I didn't confront her. I wasn't sure yet. The number could be explained by any number of things. A different route to work because of roadwork she hadn't mentioned, a detour she had taken on impulse, an errand she had forgotten to tell me about. 60 miles was not a confession. It was a question. But the questions were accumulating. There was the evening I came home to find Lily in an unusually quiet mood, sitting on the hallway stairs with her knees pulled up, watching the front door in a way that seemed less like childlike boredom and more like she was waiting for something. When I asked her what was wrong, she said nothing and smiled in that particular way children have when they've been told something and told simultaneously not to say it. "Mom said I shouldn't tell," she said, and then immediately looked frightened. The way children do when they realize they've said the very thing they were told not to say. "Tell me what, sweetheart?" I kept my voice easy, careful. "That she went to get your birthday present," Lily said. "It's a surprise. I wasn't supposed to say. Is it ruined?" My birthday was in February. It was October. I assured Lily that nothing was ruined and that I would act very surprised in February. And she seemed satisfied, and I carried the information the way you carry something fragile, gently, with full awareness of what you're holding. It might have been true. Claire was organized, meticulous. It was possible she had started birthday shopping 4 months early. But the specificity of the cover story, the precision of it, felt rehearsed in the way that only practiced lies feel rehearsed. A natural truth offered to a 7-year-old doesn't need that kind of scaffolding. That night I lay awake and counted the things I knew. A car parked 2 streets from home after 10 on a Thursday. A phone always face down. Extra mileage. A rehearsed lie fed through a child. None of it was proof. But something in me, 12 years of reading situations, of feeling the particular atmospheric pressure of something unspoken, told me that this was the surface of something that went much deeper. I just didn't know yet how deep. The following weekend was unremarkable, deliberately so. We took the kids to the park on Saturday morning. Claire made pasta for dinner. We watched something on television and went to bed at reasonable hours. She was warm, present, normal in every way I could detect. And that, I realized, was itself a kind of evidence. Because the Claire I had noticed before, distracted, slightly removed, her warmth carrying a faint undercurrent of performance, was not present this weekend. This weekend she was the person I had married. Funny and easy and genuinely there, which meant she had decided, for these 2 days, to try harder. And you don't try harder unless you know you've been slipping. The name came to me sideways, the way significant things often do. Not through dramatic revelation but through the accumulation of small incidental details that one day arrange themselves into something unmistakable. His name was Owen. I had heard it before. Not recently, not in any alarming context. It had simply existed in the peripheral landscape of Claire's professional life. Owen was a creative director at a competing firm, someone she had mentioned once or twice in the vague, professional shorthand that married people use for colleagues. We presented the same client, or he did the Hartfield campaign, the one with the subway ads. A name that had passed through our kitchen and left no mark. I only remembered it because of what happened with Marcus. Our son, 5 years old and at an age where he repeated everything, he heard with the selective accuracy of a recording device that only captures the things you least want preserved. Came home from Claire's mother's house on a Sunday afternoon chattering about a man named Owen who had a dog named Pepper and who had let Marcus pet the dog outside a coffee shop. I was in the backyard raking leaves. Claire was inside. Marcus stood at the sliding door, nose pressed to the glass, telling me through it with the volume of someone who doesn't yet understand that glass is not soundproof. "Pepper was so soft, Daddy." Owen said Pepper likes children. I kept raking. "Who's Owen, buddy?" "Mom's friend. He has a red jacket." Claire appeared in the doorway behind Marcus and picked him up smoothly, redirecting his attention toward a snack with the practiced ease of a parent and, I would later understand, someone who had just heard a conversation they needed to end. She didn't look at me with alarm. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you're checking whether the thing that just happened registered. It registered. I kept my face neutral, kept raking, nodded at something Marcus said. And inside I was very still, the way I go still on the job when I'm working a situation that requires me to appear calm while my mind is moving fast. I needed to understand, real. Not a name pulled from professional familiarity, but an actual, physical presence in my wife's life. A man who knew Marcus by sight. A man Marcus had met with enough ease that he hadn't even registered it as unusual enough to mention until now, which meant it had likely happened before. I began doing research the way I would on any case, with the deliberate distance of someone who has learned to separate emotional response from information gathering. I found Owen's professional profile easily enough. He was a creative director at a boutique agency downtown, visible on his firm's website, on a professional networking platform, in coverage of a design award he had won the previous year. He was 41. He looked, in photographs, exactly as professional and unremarkable as you'd want your wife's colleagues to look. His apartment building was on Ackley Street. I sat with that information for a long time. 3rd floor, I thought. Amber lamp. Curtains partially drawn. The connections were assembling themselves the way evidence does when you've gathered enough pieces. Not through logic alone, but through something more intuitive, a felt sense of pattern. And the pattern was becoming undeniable. But I needed to be certain. I needed more than circumstantial geography and a child's offhand mention of a man with a dog. Around this time, something else began to trouble me. Something that had nothing to do with Owen, or at least I didn't initially think it did. Claire's sister, Nadia, called me one evening when Claire was out. This in itself was not unusual. Nadia and I had always gotten along, and we occasionally called each other independently. But there was something in her voice that evening, a careful quality, a hesitancy at the edges of her sentences, as if she were navigating around something she had decided not to say directly. She asked how things were going, how the kids were, how work was, all the surface questions that serve as scaffolding for a real question that hasn't been asked yet. "How's Claire?" she said finally. "She's good," I said. "Out with a colleague tonight. Some work thing." A pause. Half a second, maybe less. "But I heard it." "Right," Nadia said. "Of course." We talked for another few minutes and hung up, and I stood in the kitchen holding the phone and feeling that particular silence that follows a conversation that almost said something. Nadia knew something, or suspected something, and she had called to take the temperature of a situation she couldn't directly address. I was now operating on multiple levels simultaneously. The investigation, the maintenance of normalcy, the quiet reading of everyone around me for additional information. It was exhausting. It was also, in a way I am not entirely comfortable admitting, familiar territory. Reading a room, managing multiple threads of information, maintaining composure under pressure, that was the job. I was good at the job. The problem was that this wasn't a case. This was my house, my children, my life. And the professional distance that served me on the street was, in my own kitchen, a form of its own kind of damage. I started sleeping poorly. Not dramatically, not lying awake in anguish, not visibly deteriorating, but lightly, close to the surface, waking at small sounds the way I had when we first brought Lily home and every creak of the baby monitor pulled me up out of sleep. I noticed myself watching Claire's hands when she spoke. A tell in interrogation. People who are lying about something present will often perform stillness with their hands. An overcorrection. Claire's hands had always been expressive. She talked with them, gestured with them, used them to anchor her thoughts in physical space. They had become quieter. Not still, not frozen, just edited, as if some layer of her had imposed a filter on her naturalness. One afternoon I drove down Ackley Street again in my own car, out of uniform, during my time off. I told myself I was just passing through. I told myself I was just making certain about what I already suspected. I told myself a lot of things that were true and beside the point. Owen's building had a small parking area in the rear. I noted that Claire's car was not there, which told me nothing conclusive. A black sedan I didn't recognize was parked near the entrance with a gym bag visible in the back seat. I sat in my car on the far side of the street for several minutes. Felt the strangeness of the situation settle over me. A police officer conducting informal surveillance on a private citizen, on his own time, because his wife might be there. The absurdity of it and the heartbreak of it existed in exactly the same space. Then I drove home and helped Lily with her homework and made dinner and put Marcus to bed and read him 3 chapters of a book about a small bear who goes on improbable adventures. And then I sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep and thought about what I was going to do next. There's a professional rule that I have followed throughout my career, one that was drilled into me early and that has never failed me. Do not act on suspicion. Act on evidence. Suspicion is the beginning of an investigation, not the end of it. The moment you treat suspicion as proof, you compromise everything, your objectivity, your judgment, the legitimacy of whatever action you take. I applied this rule to my own marriage with a discipline that, in retrospect, I understand was both my greatest strength and a way of delaying the inevitable confrontation I wasn't yet ready to face. I began keeping notes. Not written ones, the risk of Claire finding them was too real, but mental records organized by date and observation, filed in the systematic way I organize case notes. I noted dates of irregular mileage, dates of late evenings, dates when Claire's phone appeared to be on silent, when she left the room to take a call, when she came home from work events that she mentioned only in passing. The pattern that emerged was clear and painful. Thursdays and occasional Tuesdays. Those were the days when the small irregularities concentrated. Not every Thursday, not every Tuesday, enough variation to create plausible deniability if I had challenged her, but too consistent to be coincidental. I want to be honest about the state I was in during this period. I was not cold. I was not simply a professional conducting an impartial investigation. I was a husband who loved his wife, who had loved her for 9 years, who had built a life with her and raised 2 children with her and believed in us in a fundamental, foundational way, and who was now watching that belief erode piece by piece. The control I maintained was not the absence of pain. It was the management of pain. A different thing entirely. There were moments of doubt, genuine doubt. I would watch Claire laughing with Lily over something at dinner and think, this is not a person conducting a deception. This is exactly who you married. And then I would remember the window on the 3rd floor of a building 2 streets from our house, and the doubt would shift direction. I reached out to a friend named Garrett, who had left the force 2 years ago to open a private investigation firm. We had worked together for 6 years, trusted each other completely, and maintained the kind of friendship that survives long periods of silence because it was built on actual substance rather than proximity. I didn't tell him everything. I told him enough. I need location corroboration, I said. Specific days, specific address. Nothing more. Garrett didn't ask me to explain. He said he'd handle it and send me what he found. He was professionally neutral and personally kind, and I was grateful for both. What he sent me 4 days later was a short file. 3 dates in the past month. On 2 of those dates, a vehicle matching Claire's registration was identified in the vicinity of the Ackley Street building during evening hours. On the 3rd date, the same vehicle was tracked to a restaurant on Waverly, 2 miles from downtown. The restaurant. That was new. I looked it up. It was the kind of place people chose for specific reasons. Intimate, low-lit, with the kind of menu that signals effort rather than expense. Not somewhere you went with colleagues for a working dinner. Not somewhere you went alone. I asked Garrett as a favor whether he could find out if Owen had a reservation there on that date. He looked into it, carefully and without any footprint, and confirmed that a reservation had been made in a name that could have been Owen's, though the restaurant didn't release full details. It was not absolute proof. But the architecture of it, the location, the date, the type of establishment was consistent with everything I already knew. What I had not expected was what came next. One evening, Claire mentioned casually that she was thinking of going to visit her friend Diane the following Friday. Diane lived an hour outside the city, in a small town with a farmhouse and 2 large dogs that the children adored. The visit was plausible, entirely normal, in fact. Claire visited Diane 3 or 4 times a year, usually on weekends when I was working. I noted the date and said nothing. I also, very quietly, texted Diane on a pretext, a question about a recommendation she had once given for a children's book that Marcus might enjoy. Diane responded warmly and in detail, and at no point did she mention an upcoming visit from Claire. People who are genuinely planning visits tend to mention them to the person they're visiting. I let the Friday approach without saying anything. That morning, Claire packed a small bag, kissed me and the kids, said she'd be back Saturday afternoon, and drove away. I watched her car until it disappeared around the corner. Then I called Garrett. He located her car, within the hour, at a parking garage on the south side of the city, 6 blocks from Ackley Street. Not an hour outside the city. Not at Diane's farmhouse. 6 blocks from the building with the amber lamp and the partially drawn curtains. I sat with this information until the children were in bed that night. I sat with it through breakfast the next morning, through Lily's inevitable debate about whether cereal was an acceptable dinner substitute and Marcus's extended monologue about a dream he'd had involving a talking car. I sat with it through all the ordinary, irreplaceable noise of a Saturday morning with 2 small children, and I felt, beneath the noise, the particular silence of something ending. Claire came home at 3 in the afternoon as she had said she would. She seemed relaxed. She had stopped for flowers. A bunch of yellow chrysanthemums she set in the vase by the kitchen window with the ease of someone returning from exactly the trip she claimed to have taken. She asked about the weekend. I told her it had been fine. She asked if the kids had been good. I said they had been great. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard where Marcus was playing. And she looked, in that moment, entirely at peace. I understood then that this was not new. This was practiced. This was something that had been going on long enough that she had developed an architecture for it. Routines, cover stories, emotional compartmentalization. The ease of it was not negligence. It was experience. And I thought, how long? I chose a Sunday. Not a dramatic choice, not a strategically calculated one. Simply the first day when the children were at Claire's mother's house for a regular afternoon visit, when the house would be quiet, when there would be no small ears absorbing what was about to be said. I had decided, over the preceding days, against the kind of confrontation that begins with accusations and evidence spread on the table like a prosecutor's opening statement. Not because I lacked confidence in what I knew. I had, by then, more than enough to be certain, but because I understood, from years of interviewing people, that how you begin a confrontation determines what you get from it. If you come in with everything at once, the other person shuts down or performs shock or diverts into secondary arguments about methodology rather than answering the central question. I wanted the central question answered. I wanted the truth, not a defense. Claire was in the living room with a book when I came in and sat in the armchair across from her. She looked up. Something in my face. Something I apparently didn't control as completely as I thought I had. Shifted her expression in a way I had never seen before. Not guilt, not fear, not calculation. Something quieter. Something that looked almost like relief. I need to tell you something, I said. Daniel, she started. I know about Owen, I said. The silence that followed was the longest I have ever sat through. Outside, a car passed. A door closed somewhere down the block. The refrigerator in the kitchen hummed. Claire set her book face down on the cushion beside her. She didn't close it, I noticed, as if some part of her needed to believe she'd be able to pick it up again shortly. She was wearing a gray sweater and her hair was loose, and she looked, at that moment, precisely like herself. Not diminished, not monstrous, just precisely herself. That somehow was the hardest part. How long have you known? She said. Long enough. How much do you know? Enough, I said. I want you to tell me the rest. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she looked at me, and she did something I had not expected. She told the truth. Not defensively, not tearfully, not with the kind of elaborate justification that people use to convert their own guilt into someone else's failure. She simply told the truth, the way someone tells the truth when they have been holding it for too long. It had begun 8 months ago. A work event, a conversation that went on too long, a reconnection that turned into something neither of them had planned, or so she said, and I believed her in the sense that I believe most things said in the initial honest impulse before people start editing their own narratives. Owen was not a stranger. He was someone she had known professionally for 3 years, someone she had always found interesting, someone who had become, gradually and without a clear starting point, something more. She had not wanted to hurt me. She had not wanted to hurt the children. She had convinced herself, for months, that she could contain it. that it could exist in its own compartment without touching the rest of her life. That's not how it works, I said. I know, she said. I know that now. I asked her whether she loved him. The question surprised me even as I asked it. Not the words, but the steadiness with which I said them. She hesitated for exactly long enough to tell me the answer before she spoke it. I don't know, she said. I think I was in love with the way he made me feel, which is different. But I know that doesn't make it better. It doesn't, I agreed. We talked for 2 hours. Not fighting, talking. Quietly, carefully, with the strange formality of two people who have known each other for a decade and are now navigating the fact that the architecture of that decade contains a structural failure. I asked questions and she answered them. I said things I needed to say and she received them without deflecting. There was grief in the room, real and mutual, and there was also, I'm still not entirely sure what to make of this, a kind of dignity. I told her about Nadia calling. She wasn't surprised. Nadia had guessed, had confronted Claire privately 3 weeks earlier and been told a partial truth, a version stripped of its worst elements. Nadia had warned Claire to either end it or tell me. She had done neither. I told her about Lily's comment about the birthday present. Claire closed her eyes briefly. She wasn't supposed to say anything. I told her I was going to surprise you. I shouldn't have used her like that. No, I said. You shouldn't have. I told her about the Friday trip to Diane's. She looked down at her hands again. Diane doesn't know, she said. I told her I'd visited and she went along with it because I'd described the house to her enough times. A pause. Diane is a separate thing. She helped without knowing she was helping. That's on me. Near the end of the conversation, something shifted. I had asked what she wanted, what she actually wanted, beneath the chaos and the shame and the practiced normalcy of the past months. She was quiet for a long time. I don't know what I want, she said finally. I think I stopped knowing for a while, and I filled the not knowing with the wrong thing. I thought about that. I can't live in this house the way things are, I said. You understand that? Yes, she said. I don't know yet what comes next, but things have to change. Yes, she said again. There was one more thing. Something I had held back, not tactically, but because I needed to understand it myself before I could say it out loud. When she had packed her bag that Friday morning and kissed me and the kids before leaving, she had kissed Marcus on the forehead and ruffled Lily's hair, and she had smiled at me, genuinely, warmly, in the way that had always made me feel that whatever existed between us was worth protecting. Did you feel anything? I said. That Friday morning when you left? She looked at me for a long moment. I watched her face move through several things before it settled on honesty. I felt terrible, she said. I have felt terrible for a long time. Then why didn't you stop? She didn't answer. And in not answering, she said everything. The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way people might expect. No shouting matches, no lawyers in the first days, no decisive rupture that announced itself clearly as an ending. Instead, there was a careful, painful restructuring of daily life, the kind of adjustment that happens when two people who share children, a house, and a decade of accumulated life must navigate an unbridgeable fracture while keeping the world around their children as intact as possible. Claire moved into the guest room temporarily. Her suggestion, offered quietly the evening after our conversation, accepted without discussion. We maintained, for the children's sake, a surface civility that was genuine enough that Lily didn't register the change immediately and Marcus was too young to name what he sensed. We were present. We were careful. We were not cruel to each other. Nadia called me 3 days after the confrontation. She had heard from Claire, she said. She wanted me to know that she was sorry. Not a political sorry, not a please don't be angry sorry, but a real one, directed at the specific thing she wished she had done differently. I should have called you sooner, she said. I thought I was protecting the family. I was protecting her, and I was wrong. I told her I didn't blame her. I meant it. Nadia had been placed in an impossible position by someone she loved, and she had done what people usually do in impossible positions. She had bought time and hoped things would resolve without her having to deliver damage. That was human. It was also inadequate, and she knew it. Work was its own particular challenge. Ruiz noticed the change in me the way only a long-term partner notices, not in the details but in the aggregate, the cumulative weight of something being different. He said nothing for the first week and a half. Then one shift, parked outside a convenience store on Dolman with the engine running, he said, "You don't have to tell me anything. But if something's going wrong, I want you to know I'm here." I told him the minimum. He received it with the same stillness he brought to every difficult situation. Not filling the silence with comfort or advice, just occupying it with me, which was exactly what I needed. I consulted a lawyer in the fourth week. Not with hostility, not with the intention of punishing Claire, but with the practical understanding that a marriage ending requires legal architecture just as it required personal architecture to build. The lawyer, a measured woman named Patricia who had handled enough divorce cases to be compassionate without being sentimental, walked me through the options. I listened. I took notes. I made no decisions that day. What I did decide in those early weeks was something quieter and more personal. I decided not to make my pain the loudest thing in the room. This is not heroism. I want to be clear about that. There were evenings, after the kids were in bed, after the house had gone quiet, when the grief was genuinely physical, a weight in the chest that I couldn't reason away or professionally manage. There were mornings when I woke up and the first thought in my mind was the window on the third floor of the building on Ackley Street, the amber light, the two figures in the gap between curtains, and the ordinary silver Volvo I had driven past 1,000 times parked in a place it had no right to be. But Lily still needed her lunches packed and her homework reviewed and someone to tell her she was brave when she was scared about the school play. And Marcus still needed his chapters read and his nightmares addressed and someone to explain, for the 40th time, why dinosaurs don't live in the city. And those needs were not suspended by what had happened between their parents. In November, Claire ended things with Owen. She told me this without preamble, over coffee one morning before the kids woke up. I acknowledged it without response beyond a nod. The ending of that particular thing was necessary but not, at that point, sufficient for anything. You don't reclaim a marriage by removing what broke it. The fracture was its own separate problem. We began seeing a couples therapist, Claire's suggestion again, and I accepted it for the same reason I had accepted everything else, with the clarity that my own feelings about what I wanted were not yet fully formed, and that clarity required information, including the information that therapy might provide. The therapist was good. She was particularly skilled at something that turned out to be the core of what we needed: slowing the conversation down. When you have lived inside a betrayal, either as the person who committed it or the person who survived it, everything moves fast. The emotions, the justifications, the anticipated futures, the replayed past. She slowed it all down, forced both of us to articulate things we had been abbreviating, to hear each other rather than simply waiting for our turn to speak. I learned things in those sessions that I had not known. Not about the affair, I had all the information about that I needed, but about Claire. About a loneliness she had been carrying for longer than the affair had existed. About the particular way that her needs for intellectual connection, for being seen in a specific way, for something she couldn't quite name in our marriage, had gone unarticulated for years. Not because I was cruel or indifferent, but because we had both, in the slow drift of domesticity, stopped looking at each other with intention. This did not excuse what she had done. I want to be clear about that too. Loneliness is real, and so is the failure to communicate needs, and both of those things are problems worth addressing. But they are problems with solutions that do not involve deception and betrayal. What Claire had done was her choice, made across months of sustained decision-making. Understanding the conditions that contributed to it did not shift responsibility for it. The question before us was simpler and more difficult than anything the therapy addressed directly. Could we, knowing everything we now knew, build something new from what remained? Or had too much been lost? Not in the affair itself, but in the months of lies, in the children used as cover, in the practiced normalcy that had made me doubt my own perception of reality? By December, I had my answer. Not through drama, not through a single decisive moment, but through the gradual understanding that what I needed most was not the repair of this marriage but the repair of myself. The sense of my own reality that had been systematically undermined. The trust in my own observations that the months of gaslighting, however unintentional, however compartmentalized in Claire's own mind, had eroded. We separated formally in January. Not bitterly. with the particular sadness of two people who respected each other enough to do it with integrity. We agreed on shared custody. The children would be the organizing principle of everything going forward. We agreed on financial terms without prolonged negotiation. We agreed, silently but unmistakably, that the children would never be witnesses to our grief or instruments of our conflict. On the last evening that we were all four together in the house before the practical logistics of separation began, I sat on the back porch after the kids were in bed and looked at the yard, the grass Claire had planted in the spring, the rusted garden chair neither of us had gotten around to replacing, the tire swing I had put up for Lily 2 summers ago that Marcus had long since claimed as his own. It was cold. The sky was clear, the stars unusually visible for a city night. I sat there for a long time. I thought about the window on Ackley Street, about the smell of cold asphalt and diesel and takeout in the October dark, about the moment my professional attention and my personal life collided in the most unexpected possible way, in the most ordinary possible setting. A routine patrol, a familiar car, a lit window 3 floors up. I thought about how much of our life had been real, not whether it had been a lie, because it hadn't been, not entirely, not the Lily years and the Marcus years and the Sunday mornings with coffee and the kitchen table covered in design mock-ups. Those things had been real. They remained real. The betrayal didn't retroactively unmake them. But they were not anymore the future. The future was something else. Undefined, open, requiring construction. Requiring, first, the work of understanding who I was now. Not the husband of 9 years, not the officer on patrol, but the person on the other side of the thing that had happened, rebuilt from what had survived. I am, as I write this, still in that process. The house is under contract. I have an apartment, small, spare, with good light in the morning. The kids come every other week and we have found, all 4 of us, a new rhythm. Imperfect, tender, real. Claire and I speak regularly. We are, in the language of people who have done this carefully, co-parents and civil strangers. There is residual grief in the interactions on both sides. There is also, occasionally, something almost like grace. The recognition that 2 people who have caused each other significant pain can still choose to behave with dignity, for their own sake and for their children's. I don't know if I will trust easily again. I know I will trust. I have enough faith in my own capacity for connection to believe that. But the particular architecture of trust one built around Claire, the unexamined certainty, the assumption that the person you love is the person you see, that form of trust is gone. What replaces it, I hope, will be something more honest, more intentional, less invested in its own comfort. The night before I moved out, Marcus asked me where I was going. To a new place, I told him. You'll see it very soon. It has a window that faces the park. Is Pepper going to be there? He asked. I looked at him for a moment. No, I said. Just us. He thought about this. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied. Okay, he said. As long as you're there. I held him for a long time. As long as you're there. That's enough. For now, that is exactly enough. The story of Daniel and Claire is not primarily a story about infidelity. It is a story about the architecture of trust, how it is built, how it is maintained invisibly, and how, once fractured, it reveals the structural conditions that allowed it to fail. What makes Daniel's experience psychologically distinctive is the intersection of his professional identity with his personal trauma. He is a trained observer, a man whose entire career has been built on reading situations accurately. The betrayal doesn't simply break his heart, it attacks his competence. The woman he believed he could read completely had been, for 8 months, performing a version of herself he couldn't detect. That violation cuts deeper than the affair itself. The pattern of his investigation reveals this. Daniel doesn't react emotionally. He gathers data. He applies professional methodology to an unbearable personal situation, not because he is cold, but because controlling the investigation is the only form of agency available to him while everything else is collapsing. This is both his strength and, arguably, a form of self-protection. Staying in the role of observer delayed the moment he would have to fully inhabit the role of husband who had been deceived. The children function as both the emotional heart of the story and as indirect witnesses to its central failure. Lily is used, unconsciously, as a cover mechanism. Marcus casually names the man. Their innocence is simultaneously preserved and compromised. They don't know what is happening, but they are being shaped by it in ways Daniel can observe in Lily's watchful silence on the stairs and Marcus's easy familiarity with a stranger who should not have been part of their lives. Nadia's role introduces a secondary layer of moral complexity. She chose silence out of protective loyalty, and then reached out to Daniel in a phone call that said everything she couldn't say directly. Her failure was not malicious, but it was real. The failure of someone who chose comfort over truth, family loyalty over honesty. And significantly, she was right about one thing. Confronting Claire privately and telling her to either end it or come clean was the right impulse. Claire's failure to act on it is where the responsibility solidifies. What do we learn from Daniel's approach? The lesson is not that investigation is wrong or that restraint is always wisdom. The lesson is that clarity is a prerequisite for action. Daniel's methodical approach ultimately gave him something invaluable: certainty. When the confrontation came, it came from a place of knowledge, not suspicion, which allowed him to ask for truth rather than demand confession. That distinction changed the texture of the conversation entirely. Claire's behavior reveals what psychologists might identify as compartmentalization, the capacity to maintain contradictory emotional realities simultaneously. She was a loving mother, a present wife on weekends, and someone conducting a sustained deception. These existed not in alternating states but in parallel. This isn't unusual. It is one of the most disorienting aspects of complex betrayal. The person who betrays you is also, genuinely, the person who loves you. Both things can be true, and both are. At what point was the relationship already over, emotionally? The answer is probably not when the affair began, but when Claire created infrastructure for it. The cover stories, the rehearsed explanations fed to a 7-year-old, the practiced returns from places she had never been. At that point, she had made a series of consecutive decisions to sustain the deception rather than end it, and each decision built a wall that made the eventual return more difficult and the eventual damage more complete. What this story ultimately illuminates is the gap between the relationship we inhabit and the relationship we imagine we inhabit. Daniel believed, in good faith, that he knew his wife completely. This belief was not naive. It was the natural product of 9 years of shared life, of daily proximity, of the earned intimacy that long relationships build. And it was, in a specific and painful way, wrong. The accumulation effect is the story's real engine. No single moment, not the parked car, not Marcus's mention of Owen, not the extra mileage, would have been sufficient on its own. It was the convergence of many small anomalies, each individually explainable, that eventually became undeniable. This is how most real betrayals are discovered. Not through dramatic revelation but through the slow erosion of small inconsistencies. What changed the situation irreversibly was not the discovery of the affair but the moment Daniel understood that the cover stories had been constructed with deliberate care, that a child had been used as a prop, and that the ease of Claire's returns was the ease of someone who had practiced. At that point, the question was no longer whether the marriage had been damaged but whether the specific quality of trust required to rebuild it could be recovered. For Daniel, honestly and clearly, it could not. The story's most mature element is its ending. Daniel does not achieve resolution through revenge, or through the satisfaction of Claire's punishment, or through his own perfect recovery. He achieves something quieter and more real. The understanding that what matters most in the wreckage is what you choose to protect. For him, that was his children, his integrity, and his capacity to move forward without bitterness that would cost him more than it cost anyone else. What stays with me most about this story isn't the betrayal itself. It's the Friday morning when Claire packed her bag, kissed her children, smiled at her husband, and left for a place that didn't exist. That moment captures something genuinely hard about human beings. We are capable of extraordinary compartmentalization, of holding love and deception in the same hands at the same time. Not because we are monsters, but because we are people who make bad choices and then build elaborate architecture to protect those choices from the light. Would you have seen it sooner? Maybe, maybe not. The signs were there, but signs always look clearer in retrospect. The harder question is this: when the person you trust most is also the person most capable of misleading you, what does that do to the trust you carry forward? I think the answer is not that trust becomes impossible. I think it becomes more honest, less assumption, more attention, which is perhaps the only kind of trust worth having in the first place.